who the future people are will depend upon what we do now. So they can't really be included as equal participants in any imagined, let alone actual contract, which is why I think we should not be bound by this contractualist thinking, and we should actually just say that, well, whoever they turn out to be, we have absolute responsibilities towards them of care, and in fact, I've argued of love.
Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. One quick bit of updates for you before we get into today's show is that the podcast is now available on iTunes. Really cool, kind of almost makes it feel official. So the links to that, as well as our social media, Facebook, Twitter, are all on the website, politicalphilosophypodcast.com. So please check that out. You can subscribe and never miss an episode. Today's guest will be Wittgenstein scholar, Green Party politician, and chair of the environmental think tank Greenhouse, Rupert Read. Dr. Read studied philosophy, politics, economics at Oxford and did his postgrad in the US at Princeton and Rutgers. He's currently back in the UK in the University of East Anglia. Dr. Read specialises in Wittgenstein, in the philosophy of language and the philosophy of science. He's also a strong environmental campaigner and has been the candidate for the Green Party in the UK in a number of elections. In our conversation, Dr. Read offered a really fierce criticism of contemporary contract liberalism as too individualistic, too static, to be able to meet the challenges that we're going to face in the 21st century. We discussed whether or not there are other older forms of liberalism that might be more able to confront these challenges. I mentioned the example of John Stuart Mill, and we closed with Dr. Read offering a vision fundamentally outside of the liberal way of thinking for how he thinks we should think about ourselves and our society going forward. So, without further preamble, it's my pleasure to present Dr. Rupert Read. I am here today with Dr. Rupert Read. Dr. Read, welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
So my goal here is I want to just cover a paper you wrote called Wittgenstein versus Rawls, who these two guys are, and get into some political philosophy, essentially. So the goal here is to tackle some of the big ideas in modern political philosophy in a way that's in-depth but still accessible. And I think we're going to do it today from a dissenting point of view and offer you something a little bit different than the sort of classic, what you might call institutional liberalism, that you generally will encounter when you do your first year Introduction to Political Philosophy course. Before we get into any of that, though, I know you've done a few things. You've written on Wittgenstein, you've written on liberalism, you're also a passionate environmentalist. How do you answer the question, what do you do when asked?
Yeah, so as you say, Wittgenstein is my main man, but in recent years I've been increasingly moving into political philosophy and ecological philosophy. And I also run a think tank called Greenhouse, which attempts to bring a kind of broadly green perspective to thinking about the great issues of our time.
Fantastic. So let's just jump right in. I think people have heard the name Wittgenstein. Who was he and why was he important in the history of political thought?
So many of us think that Wittgenstein was the most important philosopher, at least of the 20th century. He was a philosopher who thought a lot about the nature of language, the nature of our concepts, and the nature of philosophy. He didn't write much about politics as such, but there have been a number of attempts now to apply his thinking in that area. Some people think that Rawls is a Wittgensteinian philosopher. I beg to differ, and that's where the paper that you were referring to really comes in.
Yeah, and I'll link to that in the description so people can read it on their own. I guess another way of putting the conversation we're about to have is if you could bring Wittgenstein back and subject him to an introduction to political philosophy class, what would he make of it? And your answer seems to be is that he wouldn't be that impressed.
Well, I think he would hate the class for certain. But I think that maybe one of the reasons why he would hate it is because he would be pretty dissatisfied, I reckon, with the kind of ideas that tend to dominate such classes. Basically, in our society, liberal political philosophy is hegemonic. It is the ruling idea in the university, and it's the ruling idea in the land, in its connection with individualism and with neoliberalism. Now, some listeners who know something about this will say, no, Rawls is an egalitarian. Liberal political philosophers are left-leaning philosophers. But for me, they have an awful lot in common with the ideological supposed opponents on their right of the political spectrum, because basically they all traced back the fundamental unit of politics to the individual rather than to the society. They think of society, and perhaps we'll come back to this later, as a kind of gigantic contract between individuals, rather than really thinking about the society or the community as coming first, as pre-existing individuals, and as also existing through and through across time, and as existing through and through in a place. Being embedded in ecosystems. So for me, liberal political philosophy doesn't succeed in thinking across time, doesn't succeed in thinking space, doesn't succeed in thinking us in our animal nature, and certainly doesn't succeed in thinking of us as through and through communitarian animals.
Yeah, so you've put a lot out there, and I think almost like the rest of the interview will be just dissecting some of that. Yeah. To those of our audience who aren't familiar, let me put it this way. When you do your introduction to political philosophy class, the first thing you will study is a book called Theory of Justice and Maybe Political Liberalism by a guy called John Rawls. And whereas you'll probably have heard the name Wittgenstein, you would definitely have heard the names of big 18th century political theorists like Karl Marx or whatever. If you haven't done this course, you probably haven't heard the name John Rawls, at least in my experience, but he's the first book on the list. So I guess to start with, who is he and why is he the first book on the list before we jump into some of the meatier stuff?
Yeah, so Rawls is the doyen of contemporary liberal political philosophy, the most influential voice in it. And his influence actually has gone well beyond the academy, even though, as you say, he's not widely known in the outside world. For example, Obama cited him quite prominently. Now, for those listeners who think Obama was the best thing since sliced bread, they may be thinking, oh, so much the better for John Rawls. For me, Obama was a relatively middle-of-the-road figure who didn't, in the final analysis, take issues of climate and our future and so on and so forth nearly seriously enough. He absolutely tried, but he's a very mainstream figure compared to where we actually need to be at this point in history. And that's what I'm interested in, where we need to be relative to where a figure like John Rawls leaves us. So Rawls is the heir to people such as Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau in the liberal political philosophical tradition, or also the social contract tradition. And basically, what Rawls thought is that you should start off thinking from a position of yourself, but abstracted from all your particular qualities, so that you become a sort of isolated essence or ego, and then imagine what kind of society would be a just society based upon that thought experimental exercise. My view is that this thought experimental exercise is extremely dangerous in stripping us out from our animality, our ecological placidness, our fundamental embeddedness, always through and through, that we're born into in community. And that basically what this method does is reassert the primacy of the individual, and that's the sense in which it is a liberal theory that places the value of freedom and liberty absolutely number one, and everything else is subsidiary to that. And I think at this point in history, that is an absolutely catastrophic basis on which to think society. I think it probably made quite good sense a few centuries ago, when our real problem was perhaps violent religious disagreement. But although there is such violent disagreement in the world today, to think that that's our main problem is to be caught up in extremely short-termist thinking. Our main problem is that we don't think long-term, we don't think like a society, and we don't think like an ecology, like an ecosystem. And in relation to those kinds of problems, I think that Rawls, it gives us a fundamentally wrong starting point.
Let's actually jump ahead to contract theory then. Now, with regards to the contract theory device, this has, I mean, maybe you can offer a better summary than I, but this has been around since Rousseau, Locke, Hobbes, and it's essentially, the idea is you can construct a social order by saying, what would people agree to form a state, to get out of a pre-state society? And what he does is essentially take it to another level of abstractness. He says, instead of real people, we're talking hypothetical people who don't know anything about the society in which they're going to create. But he actually sort of smuggles the conclusion in at the start, or at least I've always thought, by he says the people making this contract, we will give them access to what he calls the thin theory of the good. Maybe you could cash that out a little. And is he, in giving them the thin theory of the good, is he essentially asserting what he's been asked to prove?
Yeah, so I'll get to that in one sec. Let me just take a little step further back to the other people who you mentioned. So I think it's worth mentioning, for example, I mentioned Hobbes's name a while ago. Liberal political philosophers don't like to talk about Hobbes, but it seems to me that he is the grandfather of liberalism, because he's the one who starts out this entire social contract mode of thinking. He thinks of individuals as fundamentally separate from each other, and in that way having a terrible life, and they can be brought to have a better life if they're brought together and subjected to a state. And then, of course, as we mentioned, there is Rousseau, who, for example, in the opening of the discourse on inequality, says, when human beings are in their ideal paradisical state, they're alone, they wander around by themselves, they occasionally meet to procreate. It's these kinds of imaginings that stand for me at the basis of liberalism and fundamentally infect it. And Rawls doesn't escape from this kind of infection.
There's also, sorry to jump in, there's also, just listening to you talk, another line you could draw from Hobbes to sort of modern contract liberalism, which is the sort of overt rationalism of Hobbes. I think Hobbes in his head thought he was a scientist, right? Which is that an idea that's occurred to a number of moral and political philosophers, rather than sort of, you're talking about living creatures, right? You're talking about human beings, you're talking about emotions, and like how a lot of this is about how we feel about stuff. Whereas Hobbes had a very, I mean, he thought he was basically doing algebra, I think, in his work. Rawls isn't quite that, but there is an overt, let's just work it out in the most rational way, this is the logical conclusion, bish bash bosh, you're done, right?
Yes, that's absolutely right. So liberal political philosophers don't really take seriously that we are embodied creatures. They don't take seriously that we're emotional creatures. I think they don't take seriously that we are mammals, that we are primates, that our caring for our children and for future generations is at the absolute heart of who or what we are. I think of liberal political philosophy as political philosophy for reptiles, but thankfully we are not reptiles. We don't eat our own young if we come across them. Wittgenstein emphasized these aspects of our life and emphasized that we have what he called forms of life, which are fundamental and non-negotiable and go far beyond the things that philosophers typically restrict themselves to, namely, as you mentioned, our rational character. It seems to me that too many philosophers have thought of us as fundamentally rational beings, primarily because, of course, that's what philosophers like to think of themselves as being. It's not surprising that for a philosopher, being rational, being intellectual is the most important thing, because that's the thing that philosophers are good at, or that they put at the heart of their lives. So what we need is philosophers such as Wittgenstein, and there are others too, of course, such as Nietzsche or Merleau-Ponty, who think beyond that and take seriously the full panoply of our human and animal nature. So going on from that to Rawls, you mentioned the idea of the good, but turning to this question of the right and the good, because as you've implied, it is absolutely central. Rawls, unlike classical liberals, tries to argue that it's possible for political philosophy to be neutral between different people's conceptions of what is good, that as a society we don't have to choose a conception of what is good. We should start rather with an idea of what is right, and what that turns out to be for Rawls is what is just. My view is that this is a fundamental confusion, and one not remotely justified.
Just before you go on to your view, let me try and summarise that for readers. I'm obviously new to this medium. For listeners who, might not have come across this guy before, so I'm going to try and put this in the most common sense way possible. Stop me if I'm getting it wrong. But basically, the good for Rawls is like your common sense life plan, your normal desires and ambitions, your common sense morality vis-a-vis how you treat other people, your personal ethics, your religion if you have one. That, he insists, needs to be completely separate from, and in some sense inferior to, a set of legal and political axioms, which we call the right or the theory of justice. So the bottom line is, for Rawls, there really has to be as hardline a separation as possible between societal political values on the one hand, and then all the other values we might have on the other. Would you say that is a sort of fair characterization?
Yeah, I think that's roughly right. And the key point about that, in my opinion, is that what it turns out the right will amount to for Rawls is a kind of assertion of various forms of individual liberty, political liberty, economic liberty of a certain kind, liberty to choose your job, and so on and so forth. And society isn't allowed to have a conception of the good which trumps those ideas of the right. And that, I think, is one of the things which is fundamentally problematic about Rawls in this moment in history, that everything in that Rawlsian conception therefore actually ends up militating against some of the kinds of difficult communal decisions that we need to make if we're going to survive and flourish. For example, perhaps it's going to be the case in years to come, and perhaps not very long now at all, that it would be absurd to allow people supposedly free choice of career, which in formal terms Rawlsianism opens up to them, because a lot of those careers are incredibly destructive of ecology and actually also of society. So this is one way to get away into understanding how Rawls actually gets us supposedly to the position whereby, on neutral grounds, supposedly, we prove the necessity of a political liberalism. I think this neutrality is a pose, and that the reality is that every society has a conception of the good which is running it. The only question is whether you're aware of that or not. I think our society has a conception of the good running it, for example, which exactly as Rawls would want. places personal choice and individual freedom at the center of it. And I think this is proving absolutely catastrophic.
So yeah, this was like my central thing with, we could argue, and you have, right, about how desirable is it that we sort of foundationally cut off political values from all other values. But actually, before you even get there, like within 30 seconds of thinking about it, it should become obvious that this isn't possible, even if it were desirable. Like, this isn't how values work. This isn't how the language with which we express values work. So one of the ways Wittgenstein, it might not seem political, but I think is the theory of language stuff. So I'm not going to try and do a full account of it, but you have, for instance, an idea like family resemblances, which is, I may butcher this a little, but the idea that word meaning is like a set of family resemblances. There's a set of recurring themes, there's a set of recurring ideas in a particular word, but a lot of words, and particularly normative words, lack a really strict definition that adheres to every usage. So for instance, when we talk about freedom or any political concept like that, you could mean individual negative freedom, you could mean freedom as autonomous expression, you could mean social democratic freedom, you could mean some sort of stoic or mystical freedom, and there's not obviously a single definition that binds all of them. And where that comes in a political sense, I think, is the idea that you could have political values that are completely untethered from our day-to-day morality values, because the way we use a value in one circumstance is essentially to appeal to other values. If you say something isn't fair or isn't right, and you're asked why, you'll immediately just start making links to other values. If something's not fair, you'll say, well, it's because people weren't treated equally, people didn't take responsibility, whatever it is. So if you're going to have a set of political values that are completely distinct, you would either have to have completely new values, which Rawls isn't doing, to the everyday ones that we use, or you'd have to use words like justice and fairness in a way that their meaning is completely distinct from how we use them in everyday language, but that isn't how language works, right? Did I make sense through all of that?
I think you put that very well, and what you put your finger on there, as you say, is one of the ways in which, in this slightly peculiar way, as typical of liberals, Rawls tries to Rawls tries to put a kind of hard line between ethics and politics, and make politics in this sense autonomous. Excuse me. As I said earlier, I don't think he makes it autonomous in the right way, in the sense that what he doesn't do is pay proper attention to considerations of political power in a way that enables us to think politics beyond ethics. But he tries in this kind of bizarre theoretical way to do what we've just described. And I think that does tend to run afoul of Wittgenstein's thinking on language. I'd like to add to what we've just said a couple of further key ways in which I think Wittgenstein offers a kind of a different approach from Rawls. And they're to do with, again, with this fundamental idea of language in Wittgenstein. So Wittgenstein is well known for objecting to the very idea of a private language, a language that could be private to one person. But this seems to me to be the basis for a potent critique of individualism, and also, I would suggest, a potent critique of the fantasy of social contract, the fantasy that you could have first had individuals and then they agreed to unite together. It seems to me that actually what happened, and the way we must conceive it, is that we were always already in community, just as primates are, non-human primates today. So it seems to me that Wittgenstein's considerations against the very idea of a private language do threaten the basis for liberal political philosophical thinking. And furthermore, related to that, it seems to me that one of the fundamental ways to understand what Wittgenstein is trying to bring to the table about language could be put in the following way: that language is a commons. Language is something which it only makes sense to think of as being fundamentally present to and constitutive of persons as always already members of a community, and commonses again can't be intelligibly understood as the property of true commonses can't be intelligibly understood as it were the property of individuals. It seems to me that it's impossible to understand Rawls without understanding the centrality to his ideas of the concept of justice. So
right.
His most famous book is called The Theory of Justice, and it begins by asserting that justice is the first virtue of political institutions. And justice he caches as famously as fairness.
Right.
Now, the fundamental issue there, it seems to me, with that, it seems to me, is that I just think it's wrong. It seems to me that to place justice so centrally may have made sense in the past at some point, but is an increasingly absurd basis on which we can think our polities. And my argument is that unless you have a society which has some kind of promise of being able to have continuity over time, into the future, then you don't really have a society at all. You aren't taking future generations seriously at all. You aren't taking our nature as mammals, as carers, etc., seriously. So my argument is that the first virtue of political institutions now is survival, i.e. human survival, and that the second virtue is something like Aristotelian flourishing, some kind of genuine ways in which we can explicitly, not with some kind of fantasy of neutrality, promote conceptions of the good which are broadly agreed, if possible, and that justice, while obviously of some importance, comes somewhere after those two on the list. So it seems to me once again that in this respect it's reasonable to make the argument that Rawlsian thinking and more generally liberal political philosophy is simply past its sell-by date.
As a possible counter-response to that, I mean, I think it is the case, though, that Rawls is particularly egregious in this respect, right? In that he just sort of asserts justice is the first value of society, but then never really cashes out why that's the number one go-to. And it's not, I mean, I guess the difference, if you compare him to, say, prior liberal thinkers, is it's even more restrictive. If you had someone like John Stuart Mill, they would do the same thing and say utility, right? But what he means by that is he's sort of just using it as a catch-all for all things that I think are innately desirable. Or if you take later liberal thinkers, Hobhouse or someone like that, they would say liberty, by which, and they'd be self-conscious about it, they'd say, I am just using this as a shorthand for all things that are innately desirable. So Rawls is making the same move there. He's sort of using like a meta-concept, right? The difference is he restricts his meta-concept solely to the political. This is only about how institutions work. It's not about human needs and human comfort and human solidarity. And in those older liberal thinkers, there is a sense of human development, of sort of autonomous flourishing, on, Mill said, the permanent interests of mankind as a progressive being. And when you include a broader conception of liberty or utility or whatever we're saying, that includes that human stuff, then you can kind of project it forward and have a, I think Mill put it really well, the permanent needs of man as a progressive being. But Rawls, even for a liberal theory, has really just closed that door on himself, right? Like if it's going to be if you're making it that restrictive, it's necessarily going to be static, right?
Yes, I think that's broadly right. If I were forced to be a liberal, a Millian liberal, then a Rawlsian liberal, I think the supposed progress in liberalism from the days of the classical liberalism, somebody like Mill, to the days of Rawls are actually a kind of regress. However, I'd much rather not be forced to be a liberal at all, because it still seems to me that there are significant problems in a Millian type approach. One is the priority that remains, obviously, for him to liberty. Another is the concept that you just helpfully mentioned of progress, which is a very, very widespread idea among liberals, and again seems to be an idea which is actually pretty disastrous for us at this point in history, where we're on the cusp of essentially destroying the future in the name of continued progress. And we're fantasizing to ourselves that our children are going to have better conditions of life than we are, when actually, tragically, the likelihood is they're going to have worse conditions of life than we are. But I think more fundamentally, the very idea of progress, of some kind of linear development built into history, is itself problematic, and is itself tends to be very closely allied to liberal political philosophy.
So, I mean, okay, let me pull my thoughts together on this one. So, yes, liberalism is generally understood, but if we took something like a sort of broad-based utilitarianism or consequentialism that Mill has, right? Like, not the Benthamite narrow pleasure minus pain, but basically all things that are desirable for people are desirable. This is much maligned in Rawls. Both Rawls and Nozick start by just ruling utilitarianism right out the gate. We're not doing that.
Yes.
But it seems to me this is actually a not totally unhelpful way of looking at questions of our survival as a planet, like you said, survival, because if you start with the assumption that suffering is bad, welfare, flourishing, the good life is good, but then all human lives matter, and maybe animal as well, including future ones, then suddenly the vast ethical impetus is on the future lives, because they so vastly outnumber the present ones, and what's best for them is a matter of huge uncertainty. You could debate it forever, but what immediately becomes clear is the absolute central ethical importance of existential risk. Be it like a climate catastrophe, a nuclear exchange, anything that would stop, or even runs a small chance of stop, and it's more than a small chance now, but anything that would stop those future lives existing automatically, by this sort of calculus, goes to the number one priority. So I don't know, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yes, well, I'm sympathetic with where you were headed there. This is one reason why a lot of my work in the last few years has concerned the precautionary principle, and alongside Nassim Taleb and others, I've been trying to argue for a sort of revived version of the precautionary principle, which places issues of existential risk and of ecocidal damage front and center. And I do think that liberal political philosophy finds it very difficult to take a view which emphasizes the precautionary principle strongly, very seriously, because of its presentism, basically. In other words, liberal political philosophy finds it more or less constitutively impossible to take the future fundamentally seriously. It tries to do so by talking about climate justice or future justice and so on and so forth. But once again, the very frame of justice is unduly restrictive, where we need a frame of, well, precaution, and I would argue a frame of care. And if you're trying to pursue some kind of contractarian or contractualist methodology, then that founders on being able to include the future adequately, for reasons that are familiar to many philosophers. One of those reasons is that who the future people are will depend upon what we do now. So they can't really be included as equal participants in any imagined, let alone actual contract. Which is why I think we should not be bound by this contractualist thinking, and we should actually just say that, well, whoever they turn out to be, we have absolute responsibilities towards them of care, and in fact, I've argued of love, and that those go beyond the kind of coldly rational considerations of fairness, by means of which liberals try and I think fail to take seriously the future and the absolute need to protect it.
So we've been circling around the idea of contract theory for a while. Let's dig in here for a minute. So, okay, I've been going to Mill. He's my go-to guy for liberal philosophers. Mill said in On Liberty, society is not founded on a contract, and no good purpose is answered by inventing one in order to deduce obligations from it. Need we say more?
Well, once again, I remark that I prefer Mill to Rawls, but Mill is still not my main man. I think we can do better still. But yes, on this particular point, I think Mill is basically right. I think it's also useful here to point to Burke. Burke is disliked by many self-described leftists or progressives on the reasonable grounds that he was in some regards a problematic apologist for a very unequal, etc. society. But there were things I think that Burke got right, and this was one of them. Burke basically lampooned the idea of a social contract and said that if society is a contract, it's a contract between the dead and the living and the yet to be born. And what Burke meant by that was something I think quite similar to what I said a minute ago, namely, it's completely absurd to think of that as being anything remotely, literally like a contract. Rather, the way we ought to think about society is always already extended radically across time. And we ought to really kind of include absolutely fundamentally in our precepts for how society ought to be thought of and run that kind of care for our descendants, because of course once you start to think in this kind of long-termist way, our descendants actually matter more than our ancestors, because it's much more difficult for us to hurt our ancestors than it is for us to hurt our descendants. I'm not saying it's impossible for us to hurt our ancestors. I think we are doing that, but I think that the onus is far more kind of radically on us to seek to take care of the future. So yes, I think that there are a number of major thinkers from whom we can conclude that there are severe limitations to any kind of contract-type methodology if what we want to do is take seriously our nature as temporal beings and the nature of community as that which endlessly survives while individuals come and go. Individuals just aren't that important, and liberalism tragically errs and tragically amplifies the status quo by making individuals and frankly egos seem as though they're at the center of everything.
So then, and like I've always sort of been puzzled by like how central contract theory is, because if you start it, the origin, I mean, like, it goes back before Hobbes, but Hobbes is a good starting point. Those sorts of figures are writing in the age of state formation, right, when the nation state really got going and became a thing. And it sort of does make sense that in that sort of historical perspective, you would really want to shore up the ideology behind or there would be an instinct to shore up the ideology behind the state as concretely as possible. But it's something that's absolutely persisted, and people find rules. Like, I remember when I did my MA and like our first few classes were on rules, people find rules really compelling, and impressive people find rules really impressive. And to my mind, the contract theory thing is at best a metaphor. It's a metaphorical way of understanding what our obligations to each other are, and it, like all metaphors, it can be used well or it can be used badly. And I think in the case of rules, it's being used badly. It's unduly abstract, it's restrictive, it's time static. But even at its best, this isn't like an absolute core ontological truth about the world that we're getting at. It's a device, but it's one that really seems to have a hold over people's imagination. And if I were to try for like why, I would say is that I think when you're dealing with ethical and moral concepts, there's a huge amount of built-in uncertainty. We just don't know that much about the world, and the language we use is really imprecise in a Wittgensteinian way. And the idea of a contract, it feels like something solid and real and tangible. even if it isn't, and people sort of cling to that certainty. And I think that's why this is so salient, even though it's actually quite a sloppy way of thinking. I don't know how far along you'd follow me with that, though.
Yeah, I think what you said is broadly right as far as it goes, but I would actually go further. I would say the really, the really crucial thing here is, and perhaps you were implying this, is that it's wrong to think that this metaphor, because that's what it is more than just one possible metaphor from a host of metaphors.
No, that's exactly what I'm saying.
And there are metaphors which I would argue, especially at this time of history, should have a far more great power on us. So one of those metaphors is that we ought to think of society as in the kind of way that we think when we think as parents. I don't mean by that we should literally think of society as a family, but what I mean is that I think we should think of the way in which parents fundamentally place care for their offspring front and center in what they decide to do. And I'm influenced here by some threads in feminism, feminist care ethics, and that kind of spirit is actually more important for a time like ours and for restructuring our politics, if we were ever able to do so, than this somewhat tired contract metaphor. Also, I think it's really important to bring out, and this goes back somewhat to what we were saying earlier when I tried to suggest some Wittgensteinian reasons for being suspicious of social contract type thinking, that insofar as we think of families, and in fact always more than just families, bands, troops, tribes, as being the original political communities, right back into our animal past and right into the kind of societies and cultures you can see today in chimpanzees or in orcas. Insofar as we think that way, we have to understand that there are fundamental elements of trust that pervade such societies and make any kind of cooperative action, community, any kind of communication possible, which are, I would suggest, not possible to understand on a social contract understanding. In other words, there's an incoherence in the idea of social contract, because if you don't already trust other people and are involved with them in some way, how do you actually get to the point of being able to take seriously any contract which they supposedly make alongside you? So I think that the social contract idea of society never actually manages to generate an idea of society. All it can generate is an idea of a load of individuals smushed together.
So it's interesting listening to you talk, and this might be a slight tangent, but talking of metaphors, talking of, Wittgensteinian word games and language games and so on, what's interesting is you're talking in an underlying scientific metaphor of evolution and nature and the natural world. Whereas the Rawlsian, most modern liberal, most libertarian, most whatever, use a Newtonian metaphor. The economics does this as well. They visualize the world as discrete autonomous parts moving in stable orbits, responding to predictable inputs and outputs. And I think it feels more scientific, even though both are just metaphors. But it's not, and if anything, it's less appropriate, given that when we're talking about human well-being and flourishing, we are talking about living systems. So surely it makes sense to use metaphors that pertain to that.
Yes, just one slight correction to what you just said. Yes. Of course, our natural history is not a metaphor. I mean, it is actually the case that for millions of years we have been fundamentally communal creatures in ways that I think liberalism finds hard to understand. But apart from that point, I very much agree with what you were trying, I think, to say just then. And I'd like to bring to this a quotation from Rawls, which exemplifies, I think, this kind of problematically kind of quasi-Newtonian thinking. Exemplifies the the desperately dangerous individualism that I find in Rawls. So this is from his classic book, A Theory of Justice. I'll just read out this sentence. Obviously, no one can obtain everything he wants. The mere existence of other persons prevents this. And I think if you think about that sentence, you'll see just what's wrong with the kind of fundamental starting point of Rawls. He fundamentally is thinking there of other people as obstacles to oneself, rather than thinking of other people as enabling, or indeed of other people as co-constituting oneself. And that, for me, kind of reeks of the kind of dangerous and obsolete worldview that liberals inhabit.
So I was reminded of you talking of a quote, I don't have it in front of me, so I might slightly butcher it, but from Marx, where Marx takes the equal and opposite extreme and says, quote, there is no such thing as an individual. The individual is merely a portal through which we witness social interactions. So I think us in the West, in Britain, America, whatever, we think of that atomized view of ourselves as people who are sort of us against the world, as it were, as the sort of quote-unquote normal and natural way of thinking. But for most people, for most of history, certainly prior to contact with the West, it wasn't. The modern individual, the modern sort of Homo economicus, as it were, is a creation of ideology and a creation of the state. And I think people don't see that, right?
I think that's right, and part of my worry is that while liberal political philosophy often poses as an opponent of that kind of economistic ideology, in fact, it's by my lights, just another version of it. And as you're implying, it seems to me that now is a time when we have to take very, very seriously the limits of that individualism. By the way, it's not even a real individualism. It's a kind of faux individualism in the sense that actually our society, which I think Rawls provides a kind of de facto apologia for, is incredibly conformistic and resistant to genuinely revolutionary thinking. So we don't even succeed in being individualistic. But we have this ideology of individualism which structures many of our laws and patterns of interaction, so on and so forth, and it's pretty disastrous. I think one of the things we really badly need to do at this point in history is learn from cultures which have not been subsumed into this ideology of individualism. We ought to be learning from indigenous cultures. We ought to be learning to some extent from peasant societies. We ought to be learning even from other species. I think that there's much to learn, for example, from the extraordinary societies of whales and dolphins and bonobos. If human beings are going to survive and flourish, then they will not do so on the basis of liberal political philosophy, but they might do so on the basis of ways of thinking and acting together, which really do place the common good much more front and center.
I think that sounds like a good place to end it. There's loads more questions I could think to ask you, but that seems like a good closing. Just before we do, why don't you tell the listeners where they should follow you? I'll link to the article that we've been discussing, but is there a website, Twitter feed you'd like to make them aware of?
Sure. People, if they want to follow me on Twitter, they should go to @RupertRead, so RupertRead. And then there are many sites you can look at, but one convenient one which collects a lot of stuff together is www.rupertread.net.
Okay, great. This has been fun. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Toby.
Thank you for listening to the Political Philosophy Podcast. If you're enjoying the show, you can subscribe on iTunes. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And I'm actually kind of getting into the Twitter thing. So if you want to follow us there, you'll get not only the episodes, but I share podcasts from other philosophy podcasts. I share quotes, articles, stuff like that. So if you don't have enough political philosophy in your life, follow us on Twitter. Facebook's a bit more basic. I just put updates, episodes, and I do the extended bios of our guests on Facebook. And like I say, we're just up on iTunes. If you want to support the podcast, the best way to do it is to help us grow our audience. So any shares on social media or forwards are much appreciated. And thank you to people who have done that. So, thanks again for listening. Until next week.